The year was 1907, and the Atlantic was black glass under a bruised sky. Blackthorn Light rose like a jagged finger from the crags of a barren island 20 miles off the Maine coast. The keepers who had manned it before whispered about its cruel winds, its loneliness, and the way fog rolled in so thick it swallowed both sea and sky. Thomas Halloway had been at the post 3 months. A wiry man of 37, with a face weathered by sea air and grief, he'd taken the assignment after his wife and child died in a winter fever. Isolation was no punishment. It was an escape. Out here he could lose himself in routines, polish the lens, wind the mechanism, record the log, check the oil. Simple, mechanical motions to silence the human heart. But lately, silence had been a stranger to Blackthorn. It began with the knocking. At first, Thomas thought it was the gulls, their beaks rattling the glass. Then, one storm-shattered night, the sound came again, deliberate this time, tapping from the inside of the lantern room as he stood watch outside. 3 slow raps on the glass, though the room was empty. Thomas dismissed it as fatigue. Salt and solitude made fools of men. Yet that night, when he returned to his narrow cot, he found his logbook open on the desk. A sentence scrawled in a hand not his own. "You left us in the dark." He burned the page in the stove, telling himself ink could smudge, pens could slip, but the words branded themselves into the walls of his mind. Each day the sea heaved and howled. Each night the lamp's steady eye swept across the waves. But Thomas began to dread the intervals between the turning beams, when shadows lapped at the corners of the room. Once, he woke to find seawater pooled on the floor of his quarters, though the shutters were tight and no leak could be found. Floating in the brine was a child's wooden toy boat, warped and split by the salt. He had never owned such a thing. On the 12th week, a supply vessel was due. Thomas lit the signal lantern, but the fog thickened until he could see no farther than his own outstretched hand. He never heard the supply boat's horn, never glimpsed a hull. The island remained mute and abandoned. His provisions dwindled. He chewed mold-riddled biscuits, drank rainwater collected in a cracked basin. The loneliness gnawed, but worse than loneliness was the sense he was not alone. One evening, while polishing the great Fresnel lens, Thomas saw a figure reflected in its perfect glass. A man standing just behind him, pale and dripping with seawater, eyes black as midnight. Heart hammering, Thomas spun around. The room was empty, yet the reflection lingered in the lens, watching him, lips moving though no sound escaped. From then on, the figure appeared often, sometimes in the glass, sometimes just beyond the spiral stairwell. Never approaching, never vanishing when stared at, always waiting. The logbook began filling with entries Thomas could not recall writing. The sea takes, but the sea remembers. I kept the light burning, they never reached shore. Forgive me, his handwriting, yet not thoughts, yet foreign. One storm-lashed night, as the tower moaned under the gale, Thomas climbed to the lantern room to trim the wick. Lightning split the horizon, and in its strobing flash, he saw them. Dozens of faces pressed against the glass from outside, their mouths open in silent screams. Men, women, children, all pallid, all drowned, their hair writhing like seaweed. Thomas stumbled back, struck his head against the iron railing, and when the thunder rolled, the faces were gone. Only his own reflection stared back, haggard and hollow-eyed. Still, the whispers remained. Through the walls, through the crash of the waves, through the wind howling like a wounded beast. You left us in the dark. By the 14th week, Thomas had not slept for more than a handful of minutes at a time. The whispers grew louder at night, shaping themselves into familiar tones, his wife's voice, his daughter's laughter, bubbling and bright before it broke into a gurgle. He began to fear the lamp itself. The massive eye of glass and flame, sweeping the sea, seemed less a beacon than a watcher. When he stood close to it, he felt warmth not from the flame, but from a presence. The light pulsed as if alive, its beam pausing on him just a heartbeat too long each turn. In the dark below, the sea rose higher, waves clawing at the rocks. And sometimes, amid the roar, he thought he heard footsteps on the stairs. One dawn, after a night of violent wind, Thomas awoke at his desk. The logbook lay open before him, the ink still wet. The ship struck the shoals, the light was dark, they drowned screaming. Thomas staggered to the lantern room. The lamp was extinguished, cold to the touch, yet he knew he had trimmed the wick, filled the oil. He knew it had burned. And there, out on the horizon, floating wreckage bobbed on the swells, planks, barrels, a woman's shawl tangled in the foam. He clutched the railing, breath ragged, staring at the fragments of lives torn apart. His mind clawed at reason. Had he fallen asleep? Had the lamp failed? Or had something else snuffed the flame? From the fog below came the creak of wood, the wet slap of rope against hull. A lifeboat rocked gently against the rocks, though no oarsman sat within, only a sodden bundle. Thomas descended the spiral stairs, boots striking iron, heart a war drum. At the base of the tower, he found the boat half smashed upon the stones. Inside lay a corpse, a man with seaweed in his beard and black water in his lungs. Thomas recoiled, but recognition tore through him. The dead man's face was his own. Thomas stumbled back from the lifeboat, slipping on the slick stones. The drowned corpse, his corpse, rested twisted among seaweed and splintered oars. The pale lips were slightly parted, water trickling free as though the lungs still wept the ocean. "No," Thomas whispered, clutching his head, his breath coming in jagged sobs. "I'm alive. I'm here." But when he raised his eyes, the tower loomed above, its lantern extinguished, a gutted eye staring blind at the sea, and the whispers pressed in from the fog. "You left us in the dark." The wind carried laughter, his daughters, mingled with shrieks and the groan of drowning men. Thomas staggered back into the lighthouse, slammed the heavy door, and slid the iron bolt. But the air inside was no refuge. The spiral stairwell seemed narrower, the shadows thicker. Every creak of his boots echoed as though he were not alone. In the lantern room, he clawed at the wick, splashed oil with shaking hands, struck match after match. Flames bloomed and died, snuffed out by drafts that had no source. Finally, the wick caught, and the lamp flared. Relief surged through him until he noticed the light did not reach the sea. It circled, yes, but the fog swallowed it whole. And in the black glass of the Fresnel lens, reflections moved independent of him. Faces, pale and dripping, pressed outward as though the lens itself imprisoned them. A woman's hollow eyes, a boy with seaweed in his hair, a sailor with a broken jaw. Their mouths formed silent words, but then he saw her, Eleanor, his wife's face. And beside her, little Mary, curls plastered with brine, lips blue. Thomas collapsed against the railing. "No, no, no. I didn't leave you. But he had. That winter night, when fever racked their bodies, he'd fled the house for the apothecary, leaving them to shiver in the dark. By the time he returned, Eleanor and Mary were gone, their eyes already clouded. He had buried them, yet here they were, etched into the light. "You left us in the dark," Eleanor mouthed, her words clear now. The lamp's glow swelled, searing, until Thomas turned away, shielding his eyes. The beam cut across the sea, revealing what the fog had hidden. Wreckage littering the waves, corpses tangled in ropes, children's arms reaching up before the water swallowed them. And rising with the tide, lifeboats bobbed against the rocks. One, then two, then dozens, all empty, save for sodden bundles that slowly sat upright. Corpses animated by the sea, their heads snapping toward the tower in unison. They began to climb. Thomas scrambled down the stairs, his boots striking iron like war drums. He reached the keeper's quarters, slammed the door, braced it with a chair. The walls shuddered as if fists pounded from the outside, though the sound came from everywhere at once. He seized his logbook, his hand flying across the page in frantic script. The light failed. They drowned. They are coming. But when he looked up, the words shifted. Ink wriggled like worms, reshaping into another sentence. "You are already dead." Thomas hurled the book into the stove, flames devouring the pages. But the words burned themselves into his skull, echoing with each heartbeat. Night dragged on like a wound. The tower filled with sounds, wet dragging footsteps, whispers seeping through cracks in the stone, the rattle of chains against the stairwell. He pressed himself into the corner, lantern in hand, oil fumes choking him. Then came the knock, 3 slow raps against the door of his quarters. Deliberate, patient, his lantern flickered, the flame thinned to a trembling blue, casting shadows that stretched and writhed across the walls. The knock came again, and the door shuddered. The chair scraped forward. Thomas gripped his knife, knuckles white. "Stay back!" But the door swung open on its own, and the stairwell beyond yawned black. At the bottom of the steps stood the drowned man, his own corpse, skin bloated, eyes black as tide pools. Water streamed from its mouth as it croaked. "You left us in the dark." Thomas fled upward, knife clattering from his hand, his boots clanging on the spiral stairs. The tower groaned, the walls narrowing, the air growing briny and heavy as though he climbed into the ocean itself. At the lantern room, he slammed the hatch and turned the lock. He pressed his back to the glass, chest heaving. The lamp still burned, but the flame pulsed like a heartbeat. He turned toward the lens and froze. The room was full. Wall to wall, the drowned pressed against him, their faces blistered and pale, hair floating in water that wasn't there. They swayed as one, their black eyes fixed on him. Eleanor stepped forward. She raised a dripping hand, touched his cheek. The cold burned. "Stay with us," she whispered. Her voice was both in his ear and in his skull. "The light is ours now." Thomas staggered back, striking the railing. The sea below roared, waves clawing at the rocks. Behind Eleanor, Mary lifted her small arms toward him. "Papa," she gurgled, her lips trembling. The railing buckled under his weight. For a heartbeat, he teetered between the light and the abyss. Then the drowned surged forward, arms reaching, pulling him down into the dark. When dawn broke over Blackthorn, the supply ship finally arrived. The crew found the tower silent, the door ajar. The lamp was extinguished, its great lens cracked. The logbook lay open on the desk. The final entry, scrawled in a shaking hand: "The keeper is gone. The light is theirs." But when the captain turned the page, he frowned. For the entry was dated 3 years earlier, in 1904, the year the last keeper had disappeared without trace. And as the crew hauled supplies into the tower, none of them noticed the pale face watching from the cracked lens, lips mouthing words only the sea could hear. "You left us in the dark.